welcome everybody who's joining us here in person in a sunny Manchester, which I think is surprising and enjoyable for everybody. And for everyone who's also joining us online as well, welcome to our latest event. I'm really pleased to be joined by Jonathan Aspinwall, executive producer of the BBC's News podcasts, including Newscast, whose 20-year career of the BBC spans BBC Breakfast, 5 Live, Radio 4, editing Laura Kuenssberg's programme, to name a few. But really pleased that for the next hour, we're actually going to be chatting specifically about podcasts. I'm sure we'll delve into all the different various podcasts that Jonathan's been involved in. I think we've had Ukrainecast, Americast, Eurovision cast, I think. It's all the casts, I think it's safe to say. But just to say, for everyone in the room and obviously online as well, we're going to be doing a chat between myself and Jonathan for about 40-45 minutes, and then we're going to open up questions to the floor. For those of you who are watching online, please do tweet us with any of your questions at Broadcast Revo, and you can also follow us on Instagram at Broadcast Revolution. We're also going to be doing a short poll at the end as well, so if you wouldn't mind responding to that at the end, that would be fantastic. So Jonathan, I obviously briefly touched on your experience, but you know, your history has spanned radio, TV, and now you're looking after and leading podcasts. So talk to us a little bit about that journey and what brought you to taking on podcasts. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting. I was reflecting on what I like about doing podcasts, and I think the thing I like most about podcasts is I have never seen such a strong reaction from the audience as you get from podcasts. I mean, it's just such an intimate medium in a way that I've always thought kind of radio and telly is very intimate, but there's something about leaning into a podcast which builds up a really unique relationship with the audience. So I'm really struck by the podcasts that I've worked on, Americast and Ukrainecast and podcasts like that, and recently the Shamina Begum Story podcast. You get such powerful, kind of intimate emails from the listeners in a way that I've not seen perhaps in telly and radio. So I think that's something really, really special about podcasting. And why did I want to be involved in podcasting? Well, you know, you can see the way the industry is shifting. I can see what's happening in America. And if we follow America, as sometimes we do, you can see that radio audiences are going down and podcasting audiences are going up. And being at the start of that kind of revolution is really, really key, because obviously you guys know that, podcasts have feeds, and if you establish a feed, it's really hard to build an audience in podcasting. And so you want to get there at the start. And that's partly why I wanted to jump into it. But it's just such a rewarding, interesting area. And it's also an area where there is so much competition, and that really keeps you on your toes. I mean, it's just so competitive. It's unbelievable. Yeah. There's quite a lot there that I think would be really great for us to unpack. You mentioned there about the audience, and that's really interesting, because I suppose with a live radio program, TV, you have that live interaction. You have your radio phone-ins, and you can tell who's engaged in that moment. But it's a very different kind of intimacy, I think, with a podcast. But I suppose if we focus on specifically on Newscast and the audience that Newscast has, what's the makeup of that audience? How are they listening, and how has that sort of evolved? Because I suppose Newscast itself has sort of already been on its own kind of journey, really. Being totally. Brexit cast, new presenters coming in. So what does that audience look like? So, and I think this mirrors a lot of news podcast audiences. It's younger than traditional news radio and news TV audience, particularly for the BBC it is. So it's, I have to be honest, it's quite male podcasting, interestingly. The stats show that it's a younger audience, but it's also male. So there's definitely work about bringing in a kind of female audience and a more diverse audience. That's certainly the case. I think there's something about podcasting that it's interesting. We've done some kind of research into this, and people really lean into a podcast. So it's much less of a with Breakfast Telly, when I worked at Breakfast Telly, I was really struck by how people would watch Breakfast Telly, they put the TV on, they put it on at 6 o'clock in the morning or whatever, 7 o'clock in the morning, and it'll still be on at 9:15, and you go in and out of the room. With a podcast, actually people really lean in. It's quite a commitment, it's a time commitment, and I think we need to think about that in terms of our podcasts. It is a much more ruthless medium, partly because of the competition, but also because people are making a commitment in a way that they're not making a commitment with radio and TV, in my experience, because it's such an intimate thing. So I think there's something about interesting when people listen to podcasts. So our experience is that people are listening to podcasts when they're walking the dog, when they are, they might be cooking, but they're often doing a kind of solitary exercise, as opposed to, the example where I use the Breakfast Telly, where people are coming in and out of the room and it's really busy and it's almost like wallpaper, it's kind of background noise a bit. With a podcast, there's definitely a leaning in kind of situation. So it's ruthless because of that. And it's ruthless. We know that the completion rate, so we study the data. The data obviously is fascinating for podcasting compared to, you have so much more data compared to possibly radio, certainly. In my experience, I can see completion rates, obviously. I can see profiles of who's listening, who's not listening. I get the stats in terms of daily stats in terms of the listening figures that you just don't get for radio. And so I see all the time with the completion rates, I'm slightly obsessed with our completion rates. So when people switch on, when they don't switch off, and it's ruthless. You have to really hook people in the first 2 minutes in a way that you don't in other mediums. I think in kind of radio and TV, it can be a slower build, but in a podcast, it's right from the start.
Because I suppose if the attention is fully there and they're not gripped by what you're doing, like to your point, there's so much competition out there.
Completely.
And I suppose that kind of leads me to my next question in terms of, with the likes of, you've got the news agents, you've got other daily news podcasts like Sky's daily podcast. You've even, the stories of our times. How do you? What's I suppose newscast's point of difference, or how do you try to create something that's slightly different? Because I suppose one could argue that if you're going on the schedule of all these daily news podcasts, some of the stories are quite similar in terms of what they're covering. So how do you sort of position newscast differently? It's a different offer.
It is a different offer, and I suppose certainly with the BBC we've got the kind of impartiality aspect to it all. I would say that our kind of unique selling point is definitely around the fact that we are trusted, and obviously trust levels go up and down with all the kind of various things that go on with the BBC, but BBC News is fundamentally trusted, and that's our big selling point, and also the access to our extraordinary kind of reservoir of correspondents and reporters and people out in the field. That is unrivaled, and so that's our USP really, I guess. Talent is absolute. I hate using the word talent because it just sounds a bit pretentious, but talent is absolutely everything. And it's interesting when you're recruiting people now to work at BBC News. I guess the podcasting element is now the digital kind of arena is now a key thing. So we're looking for broadcasters who are authentic, who can communicate in a really conversational way. And I guess we're shifting slightly from BBC journalists and BBC presenters who might in the past have been quite kind of formal and, I'm the BBC News, I'm telling you how to do things. And now it's kind of, we've got this mantra, which is our podcasts are about insights from trusted friends. So basically we're looking for people who are able to converse. So brilliant example would be Mariana Spring, Chris Mason. They're the people who are cutting through nowadays. Mariana Spring has done loads of podcasts. She's now a host of Americast. She's a huge rising star, amazing talent, lovely to work with. Chris Mason as well. Just such a nice guy to work with. And he represents, Chris Mason, to some degree, to me, represents a new kind of BBC in a sense that he can do kind of real. He can talk in like everyday language. He's engaging, he is smart, and he's trusted, and that's really key, I think.
Because I suppose, to that point, they almost have to shift slightly in their style, because presenting a podcast, does have some differences, like to your point of it's far more intimate, it's meant to be a far more personable space. So like Adam Fleming, for example, who presents most of the newscast episodes, having to sort of slightly change what he's known for and how he appears, I suppose, on TV when he's giving his political reports to when he's presenting a podcast. And I suppose the skills that are required, I suppose, to make that change are quite interesting, aren't they?
It's really, it's hard finding podcasting talent. It's really interesting who, and we've tried a lot of people actually. I shouldn't maybe say that. But,
that's fine. They're not here, so
just,
we're okay.
Just between us. So it's interesting what works and what doesn't work actually. And it's really, really interesting when people come in the room and they do a podcast, and they often make the mistake that it's switching on the mic and it's talking. And actually, and I was doing I'm doing a podcast pilot tomorrow actually, and I was really wrestling with this, which is you have to have the structure, but you still have to have a kind of beginning, middle and end. The listener still has to go on a journey, but on the other hand, they have to sound like they're being really conversational and that they haven't pre-planned it. And it's actually, as a producer, it's quite hard because you're working out what's the best thing. How much do I script this? How much do I make it sound like a natural conversation? So we, for Newscast, for Americast, for Ukrainecast, for all the podcasts I worked on, apart from the Shamina Begum story, for all of them, we actually do kind of bullet points. And we're always saying to people, right, this is the kind of the base. So the presenter will come in, we'll say, this is the starting point, but feel free, obviously, to go off on a limb and to take it in a different direction if you feel it's going really, really well. And obviously the beauty of a podcast is you can edit it. So, I mean, it's just, and kind of there is a fearlessness about that actually. We're always saying to people, just, it's all right, this is okay, you know, like this is pre-recorded, it's going to be great, but you also don't want them just to waffle on, and that's a challenge.
And I suppose that's then the skill you're looking for. It's a structured conversationalist, but it's
completely.
somebody who is a conversationalist and can go with it and take it down the way, down the path that's most interesting, which I think is really fascinating. In terms of then how the daily podcast is put together, because obviously it's dictated by what's covered. How do you decide what topics and stories you're going to cover? When's the sort of cut-off point really in terms of, right, this is what we're covering, we need to record it now? And I suppose how does that decision-making process happen?
So I mean, it's quite interesting because for a lot of news podcasts, it's worth saying, and this applies to news agents, it applies to nearly all of these podcasts, people aren't coming to news podcasts as the first source, in general, as their first source of news. I don't think there are very few people who say, I'm going to listen to newscasts because I've not heard the news today. There might be some people, but I don't think the vast majority of listeners. Same for news agents. People have often got the news on their phone, and then they're looking for added insights from people they trust. And that's the kind of mantra that I say over and over again. Whenever we're picking talent, whenever we're picking producers, whenever we're working out how a podcast works, it's added insights from your trusted friends. So I think that the day kind of, we're often stepping back slightly, and we're driven by slightly seeing what's obviously in the news agenda, but also seeing the data in terms of which stories are resonating online. So we'll be across kind of which stories are doing well on BBC News Online, which stories are the audience engaging with. We often hear from the likes of 5 Live. We'll hear what's really working on 5 Live. So what are people phoning in on? What are they contacting 5 Live about? So we're governed by some of that in our decision making. It's a kind of 12-hour cycle. About a third of the content is planned in advance, about kind of a week to 2 days beforehand, and then the other 2/3 is very, very topical. Probably for newscast, about half the pod features BBC News talent. So we're kind of mining that deep reservoir of talent, which is in New Broadcasting House in London or across the world. And then about the other half is guests, and where we kind of do need help from kind of PRs, etc. It's the holy grail of experts who are able to speak in plain English, who are conversational, who are effectively trusted friends with added insights. So are they going to make you feel smart when you go to the pub with your mates? and have they conveyed that in a really conversational, authentic way? That's kind of what we're looking for. We're constantly looking for experts, financial experts. It's hard to find financial experts. It's interesting, actually. Everyone's looking for kind of the next Martin Lewis.
Yeah.
That is a really kind of an interesting kind of area. So we're always looking for experts in those kind of key areas of personal finance, housing, that kind of thing, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. And I suppose in that same sort of vein of thought, because I know you mentioned earlier, you can see which stories are really resonating, which newscast listeners really enjoy. In terms of stories then, what are those stories that you're always looking for, those topics that you're like, we always know that we get good traction with those?
So, I mean, in general, our kind of, what we do know about news podcasts is that the audience spikes when there are big news stories which are grabbing the public's attention. So that's a kind of, I'd say that first. So, for example, news podcasts did really well in the kind of Liz Truss, kind of end of Liz Truss years. People were utterly captivated by that story, and the Boris Johnson years were great for news podcasts. And we're now in a kind of a different news landscape, and it's interesting. And there is certainly, cost of living was definitely resonating with, but kind of people really felt like people wanted solutions. And this is no surprise to any of you, but it felt like people wanted tips, advice. There is definitely news fatigue. There is definitely a sense that people are finding the news hard, and I think you would have seen this in surveys, but there is definitely a sense, particularly amongst younger listeners, that they are making sometimes assertive choices about not necessarily dipping into news, in traditional news. There is definitely a feeling that they're kind of finding it overwhelming, and that for their own well-being, they're not necessarily accessing news in a way they might have a few years ago, because it's so relentless, I think.
But obviously, and that's a challenge in itself, because all broadcasters across the board, all media, is how do you target younger audiences? And I suppose the podcast has a slight advantage because it's a choice, because it feels like a more intimate, conversational, safer space. Actually, that feels like a more comfortable medium in which to kind of grow that relationship with a younger audience.
Totally, and because they have the trust in the hosts of the podcast. So, they trust Adam Fleming, they trust Chris Mason, news agents, they trust Emily Maitlis, Lewis. Because they trust those people, actually, you are able to carry the audience through stories which may be a bit more depressing. I mean, there's definitely a challenge with the likes of Ukraine, and certainly of Ukrainecast. Our figures really fluctuate based on events in Ukraine. So we notice that when the conflict deepens and there's some dreadful, sadly, depressingly, some dreadful twist in the story, then the audiences pile back in. But certainly over a period of time, Ukrainecast has been a challenge because people do find it really difficult, and we're really, really aware of that. So we're often thinking about the mix of items in that particular podcast, so that it could be a really, really heavy listen, and it will always be a bit of a heavy listen. But we certainly think about some of the, I mean, I wouldn't say positive stories, but you certainly can think about some of the things that have happened, which are maybe more constructive elements in that story. And there's been stories of heroic efforts, and we've covered some of those aspects to take the audience with you.
The human interest, I suppose.
The human interest aspect,
The human interest in individual stories, which actually we saw a lot of on social. We saw a lot of on Instagram, in I suppose, particularly in the early months as well, which was quite interesting. I'd like to talk about how, again, you touched on it briefly earlier, in terms of how listening habits, how that kind of dictates the format, because I listen to newscasts, I listen to my daily news podcast the next day, actually, in the car, and I suppose it's a more reflective, I suppose it has to be more reflective in the way that you're recording it, in the way that you're talking about, less immediate. But I suppose, do you see many people diving sort of weeks into the archives, or actually does it tend to be, if they've not tuned in for it that week, it's probably not, they're probably not going to go delving. And I suppose, how do you kind of put that together in terms of the format, and how is that driven by listening habits?
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the first things I did when I started in news podcasts was try and work out, is there a special time when you should publish your podcast? So is there an optimum moment when you should publish a podcast? And actually the answer from our data geeks was that there isn't, actually, surprisingly. So in radio, there's a kind of peak with breakfast and there's a peak with dry time. Actually, and news agents, they drop every day around dry time as well. The answer from our data geeks, interestingly, was that we should drop it at a consistent time, and that what matters actually is a consistent expectation of when your podcast drops. We find that most people are listening to our podcast, our news podcast, the following morning. So we drop about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, partly governed by tradition, that's always been the time, partly governed by access to talent. So Chris Mason, for example, has to do a list of output before us. So he does the 6 o'clock news, he'll do PM on Radio 4, and so we have him at a certain time. So our podcast, because it's built around Chris Mason, is built on that. But so I think there is an interesting thing in terms of data. I've forgotten the question. What was that? Like waffling on.
Fine.
What was the question?
In terms of how much do listening habits affect the format in terms of, like, I mean, I was talking very simply in terms of how it has to be a reflective piece, because it's a next day rather than a today, etc., etc.
Yeah. So we tend to try and make it a bit evergreen in a way. It's less. So we often re-promote podcasts which were from a while back when there's a story which is relevant to them. So, for example, there might have been something, an explainer. Actually, there's a good example, which is Liz Truss and the local radio interviews. We compiled a special episode, got them all together, and made that a special newscast. We kind of dig that out all the time because it does really, really well. And it's interesting with the kind of latest trend. It's quite technical, but so I've just finished this Shamina Begum story podcast, which was a fascinating experience and was quite a controversial podcast. And it was part of an umbrella title, an umbrella feed called I'm Not a Monster. And it was really interesting how it's in the same, Shamina Begum story was in the same feed as the original I'm Not a Monster series. The figures for the first series have gone up loads. So people have been listening, they listen in the feed to Shamina Begum story, and then they go back to the first series as a result of being in the same feed. The holy grail for any podcaster is you want people to subscribe. So you're constantly thinking about how you can get mechanisms by which how you can get people to subscribe to your podcast. So you constantly get talent to say it, you find organic kind of fun ways of getting them to say it. It's a huge challenge. We spend a lot of time thinking about how we can get people to subscribe and how we can build up that community of listeners to subscribe. Where we say it in the episode, do we say it right at the start? We try, because you can say it right at the end of the podcast, but very few people listen to the end of a podcast. Yeah. So there is maybe there's kind of trade secrets here, but it's often like people put promos at the end of podcasts. Very few people get to the end of a podcast, whatever podcast it is. I think that doesn't necessarily apply to something like the Shamina Begum story, because that's a kind of much more, you're leaning into that even more than you are to a news podcast. But you'd be fascinated by how few people get to right to the end. They listen to the vast majority of it, but the last bit. So we're always thinking about when we're saying subscribe to us, because that's the kind of the key thing that you need. Getting people to subscribe to your feed is utterly crucial. Otherwise, you haven't got an audience.
And it's so interesting you say that, because that's exactly what I did.
Yeah.
I saw the Shamina Begum when I went back and I listened to the first season, which I thought was brilliant as well. But that's really interesting. And I think the promotional aspect of what you're talking about and the strategy is really interesting, because I suppose looking at this purely from a podcast production space, we often are asked to produce a podcast, and it's this idea that if it's created and it's there and it's on the platform,
completely.
But actually there's a whole side of how you bring that audience to it. And I suppose the one thing with the BBC, which I know we briefly spoke about yesterday, was the idea that obviously for the likes of, correct me if I'm wrong, with Shamima Begum, it went out live. There was a slot. Was there a slot on 5 Live?
So it went out on Radio 4, and then there was a discussion on 5 Live, and it was a kind of, and that was definitely the might of the BBC piling behind it, because it was such a, it was a kind of, a lot of effort had gone into that podcast.
But I suppose not all podcasts necessarily can rely on that slot in linear broadcasting to promote. So I suppose from your side of things, when you're putting together that promotional strategy, how crucial is that? But also how, I imagine it has to be a very individual approach, for each podcast we're talking about Newscast, we're talking about Shamima Begum, which I think which is always really important. I think sometimes it's often missed as well.
So 100%, and I think that's the biggest shock about coming in, not shock, but it's the biggest surprise about coming into podcasting, is just how much of your time is spent promoting it. So a third of my time is spent doing editorial, a third of my time is spent doing staffing, and a third of my time is spent promoting, and literally trying to pull every single lever. So with every podcast, when we launch a podcast, we make a list of all the potential promotional levers that we have at our kind of fingertips. So that's about kind of Twitter. So we're thinking about which talent have got a Twitter following, or who are doing particularly well on social media. We're thinking about the website. So the BBC News website, for example, we're thinking about where we'll be placed on the BBC News website, and our relationship with the BBC News website, making sure they're happy. You're just thinking about all the different places that you can try and all the different levers that you can use, and kind of word of mouth. We know that podcast listening, a lot of kind of quality podcast listening is based on word of mouth. So during a podcast, we'll be saying to people, tell your mates, tell your family, tell your friends if you like us. And we often say we're trying to build a community, because that's true, we are trying to build a community of listeners. But if you like being part of this community, tell other listeners, because it's really important to spread the word so others can find the podcast. So the promotion aspect is absolutely huge, and I think that's quite a surprise to people who come into podcasting, just how much you do that, how much you have to fight for that audience in a way that you don't elsewhere.
And I think that's a really interesting word, because actually that's what you said about communities. Because that's what we always talk about. It's, everyone, you've got these really successful podcasts, and then you've got those actually that they draw a smaller audience, but to the point we talked about at the beginning, they're dedicated, they're listening. So actually it's about growing a community, and it may be that you share communities with other types of podcasts that follow similar formats. Everyone has their own podcast makeup and different types that they listen to. But I suppose it's spending that time to nurture that community and get to know that community, because it sounds like, Jonathan, as well, you delve into a lot of the data, and that informs quite a lot of the decision making too, which I suppose for a podcast versus linear broadcasting, you have far more access to.
And I think the kind of community thing is fascinating, because you are building a group of listeners who are like-minded listeners, and I think that is a huge opportunity. And it's fascinating seeing how many people are coming into podcasting because they see the potential of doing events, and they see the potential of making money through events. And I think that is interesting, and we're still in early days because of that. I think there's also something really, once you've built that relationship with the listeners, so sometimes people look at the numbers in terms of people who are listening to podcasts, and I'd say that's only one measure. I'd say don't underestimate the strength of that relationship, because once you've got an audience who are committed to the podcast, it's the potential to do stuff with that audience that is mind-blowing. It's really interesting. You look at Restless Politics and how they're packing out kind of massive concert halls, and the success that they've made of that pod is just absolutely extraordinary. And I'm sure newsagents will go on to do events, and we've started doing some events ourselves, and they do really well. You get the response you get from the listeners is really, really interesting. And when they come up to you at the event, you're slightly blown away by like, oh my God, people are listening. Yeah, people are listening. Wow. And just like you are just, I've not seen that before, and that's something really unique.
Just a quick shout out to say to everybody in our in-person audience and online, we will be coming to questions in about 15 minutes, so please do continue to tweet us at BroadcastRevo with your questions. There's so much that we could unpack still. But one of the things that I just want to get into is the visual elements of podcasts. You know, we've seen an increase in sort of, we'll call them now vodcasts, and obviously people then watching those on social, watching little snippets, watching the full episodes on YouTube. There's been this whole sort of visual element that's really becoming quite important to podcasts.
Yeah.
And I suppose, I think I'm right in saying with the newscast, there is a window where it does appear on the news channel, but I suppose, do you see that as a key part? You know, we talk about events and the visuality of that, but I suppose in terms of video, how important do you think that is?
Well, there's a challenge there for the BBC, which is the visualization of podcasts. So the BBC wants attribution for its BBC output. So we want people to come to BBC Sounds. Our platform is BBC Sounds, and we're pushing people towards BBC Sounds. I think there's a challenge with visualization, which is if you're on YouTube, for example, that's not a BBC platform. So how do you move people around the BBC between BBC iPlayer, BBC News, you know, in terms of the future, the license fee, and in terms of attribution, that's a real key thing that we're wrestling with. But we're also aware that increasingly people like visualize podcasts, and again in America it's going nuts, and it's doing really, really well. And sometimes I'm quite surprised by the fact that quite low-tech visualized podcasts are doing really well. It's all about the intimacy and the authenticity of the talent and the strength of the personality of the talent. So again, I think it's thinking about which talent is just gonna is gonna do well in a visualized medium. So yeah, and I think it's something the BBC is definitely wrestling with, and we look at some of our competitors. So I think newsagents has been a great success. We are pretty much level pegging with newsagents from what we can see. It's interesting. There's a kind of Apple podcast charts are really interesting, because you look at Apple podcast charts and people think it's just based on downloads. Apple podcast charts is quite a complicated formula. It's a marketing tool as well as listing figures. So as well as downloads, it also includes various other things, including completion rates and other things that we're not all fully aware of, to be quite frank. So there is an interesting thing with the Apple podcast chart. How much does it actually convey hard listening? How much does it convey the number of listeners? But I'm really interested in newsagents, what they've achieved and what they've done, because they have created a buzz for the news podcast market, which is brilliant. You know, they're creating those noise. They're all lovely presenters. So two of them used to work on Americast, and Emily and John, and they are lovely to work with. And then Lewis used to work a lot on Ukrainecast, and he's also brilliant. It was a brilliant choice. So they've raised the game in many ways and created a buzz and created a noise about podcasting, which can only be good for the whole industry. It's fantastic.
Because I think some were surprised, because it wasn't obviously just the podcast that they were involved in at the BBC. They had much bigger kind of roles, but actually it's a sort of a bit of a testament to the faith they have in the podcast format, that they have left purely, and that's what they're doing, is their central kind of work.
I think they clocked really early on. So their experience with Americast, and a guy called Dino Sophos, who was the guy who set it up, and who set Newscast up as well, and who's a lovely bloke, and they set it up, and I think they were just bowled over. I remember when I started on Americast, and Emily and John just said, you know, it's just the feedback that we get all the time. We just never experienced anything like it in our careers. And John in particular had been in Washington in North America, and he came over to the UK, and he was just constantly, people were saying, I heard you on Americast, you know, and actually he'd done all this grand stuff, like the North American editor in Washington, being on the telly on the 6 and the 10, the Today programme. But the thing people were talking about was Americast. So he was really, really struck by that. And then I think they formed they were a tight team actually, together, and John and Emily worked really, really well together They're a bit like a kind of married couple. They're really they're really good fun to work with, and I miss them actually. And so it's really great to see them doing so well. But I think they also clocked that actually, I suspect that they've also clocked, you know what, there's just huge potential if we get in this market now, before it grows. If you don't set up your feed now, it's going to be harder and harder to enter into this market. And so they've got in at the right time. Certainly. And they've also seen the event. I think they've also got an eye on the kind of, I suspect, they've got an eye on the commercial aspect to all of this in terms of events and stuff like that, because they'll do well doing it.
And I suppose it's that relationship between, if you've got more than one host, that allows for that intimate kind of feeling, because you feel part of the conversation, you feel part of that friendship, part of that relationship, which is obviously what they've ddone very well. So I think that's really interesting.
It's hard to dupe the audience actually. If you, like with a podcast, I don't know, it's very difficult to, I think if you're presenting a TV program sometimes, I haven't worked on breakfast telly and stuff over the years. It's interesting which presenters get on, which presenters don't get on.
Care to tell us more?
No. But in podcasts, it's really hard to fake that.
Yeah.
It's so intimate, so authentic that actually, if you fake it, the audience can really sense it. The audience are smart. You know.
And I think you can tell when you're being, because I think what we get a lot of is the podcast is a really efficient means of transferring information.
It is.
And actually, you can see right through that if you're just being given information rather than being allowed to be part of a conversation and something that's far more authentic than what you're talking about.
And also, I think so we do Newscast TV, which is on a Thursday night on BBC One, which is a visualised version of, goes back to your visualisation point, but a visualised version of the podcast. And so politicians appear on that a lot. And it's interesting how, so they come into a studio, which is quite an intimate studio, so it's not a TV studio. TV studios, as you all know, are like vast and kind of quite intimidating places. I mean, loads of cameras, loads of kind of people, it's all kind of like, oh my God, I'm on the telly, I'm on the telly. And then you come into a podcast studio and it's so intimate. And Newscast studio, I mean, if you saw it, it's like kind of, I wouldn't say it's the most high-tech TV space ever, but it's a podcasting studio literally with kind of hidden kind of cameras. The politician comes in, they sit down, it's really intimate, and they're chatting to the hosts, and it feels really special. And actually, it's interesting how many times the politician probably says more than they might have expected to say, because it's such a intimate kind of medium, and they kind of maybe sometimes let their guard down. So it's no surprise in some ways. There's a kind of thing we're all wrestling with, which is the visualization of podcasts, how much you make it look like TV and how much you make it look, how much you move away from that intimate podcast feel. And I think it's really dangerous if you make it feel too much like a TV studio and make it feel too much like a TV program. You'll lose that USP, which is the intimacy. Which
I think is really interesting to that point, because I suppose what we look to do is okay, let's film it, let's get those snippets, but you're quite right in that you have to create the right atmosphere, because there's so much goodness that you don't want to lose.
You do.
So I think that's really interesting. I'm going to come to questions from the audience in a minute, but just as a final sort of question from me, we've talked about blend of audio, blend of visual, where we're going in terms of events, but I suppose if you were to summarise, what you see, you've talked a lot about looking to America. What are America doing? Are we a few years behind? What do you see, I suppose, as the future of podcasting? Big question.
That's a massive question. God, that's a huge question. I think children and education podcasts are going to do really, really well. It's interesting how in France, they are massive in France actually. And if I was trying to make money, I'd be thinking about getting into the children's and education podcasting market. I think that there's definitely scope there. So it's interesting how the BBC have just launched some podcasts for bite size on BBC Sounds. I'd be really interested to see the stats on them. I think that's a massive market. Anything to do with parenting and children and I think that is really open to kind of, because, you know, I'm a parent, I've adopted two kids, and I'm just really aware of the kind of, you know, you're kind of constantly trying to get it right, aren't you, as a parent, and you're trying to work out the best way to kind of, your child can be educated, that you can learn tips, I think that market will really, really, really grow, and I haven't necessarily seen anyone nail that yet.
Yeah.
So I think there is definitely scope for growth there.
Fab. Right, we're just going to come to some of the questions that we've had from our remote audience. So does a podcast need a big name or a celebrity to be successful, do you think?
I mean, it helps. Oh my God, it really, really helps. But actually, interestingly, there is a long list of podcasts with big names where it hasn't worked. And so it's really interesting how if you don't get the right presenter with the right tone, and it is harder to carry off a podcast than most people realize. So I think the talent, so we spend honestly such an extraordinary amount of time trying to think of a name, trying to think of the talent. I mean, hours and hours, hundreds of hours. I mean, the naming of a podcast process is ludicrous. And actually, you know, like in the end, we've ended up with like Americast, Ukrainecast, Newscast, but like,
but it's working.
It is working. But there've been others, like for example, we did a disability news podcast, which does well in that community, called Access All, which is presented by Nikki Fox, and it's really an absolute joy to work on that podcast and to run that podcast. The name Access All, I mean, literally hundreds of hours. And partly you're looking, you know, you're checking copyright. Are there any other podcasts called the same thing? Yeah. But then how do you encapsulate that podcast in just, so there's an interesting thing which is basically now about kind of titles of podcasts. So the SEO for podcasts is often based on the title. And so we spend a lot of time scrutinizing the title, disproportionate, crazy amount of time thinking about titles and thinking about naming. But the answer to the question, I think you can still launch a really, really good podcast without a really famous person. But I think you need to have your promotional strategy in place first. Yeah.
Apart from Newscast, what is your favourite podcast to listen to?
Oh, that's good. I mean, I like Rest is Politics. I think it's great. I think it's a really strong listen. I didn't make Gangster, but I think the kind of the BBC Sounds Gangster podcast is a really good listen, and I think that will do really, really well. It's a feed now, effectively. So they've done Gangster 1, Gangster 2, Gangster 3, and they'll keep on piling listeners as a result of that. I do like crime podcasts. I'm really determined to find one. And I think kind of the audience, I think there's an interesting thing with crime podcasts because everyone was piling in on crime podcasts. But I think the huge challenge is that people feel that actually some of the people involved in some of the victims and some of the victim families, and that maybe people have been exploited. So I think kind of we have to be really, really careful with crime podcasts because it can be so intrusive. And I think there is a potential backlash there. So yeah, and I do sometimes listen to news agents because I like listening to Lewis and Emily and John, and it's just good to keep across what the competition are doing, and we're hyper aware of what the competition are doing as well.
Yeah. Before I go to more questions from our online audience, were there any from our in-person audience? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
What do you think is ideal in time for a podcast? You are talking about serious issues, let's say politics or business.
Yeah.
And would you say every episode would have to be roughly the same length of time?
Yeah.
I'm just going to, sorry if you don't mind, I'm just going to repeat the question for our online audience in terms of
It's a great question.
what was the, what should the duration length for an episode be, particularly if you're covering a serious issue, and should they all be similar lengths?
So, surprise, surprise, there is no clear answer on this. But what I would say is a consistent length is key. again, that consistency. What is the expectation? So if you're doing a series, roughly the same length of episode, I think when I study the data, that's the impression I get. I think it's quite interesting. Over 30 minutes, might be just my psychological in my head. Over 30 minutes seems like a lot of time in busy people's lives. You know, I kind of most people I know struggle to commit past 30 minutes. So there's also something psychological about over 35 minutes. So I'm always saying, I notice kind of like a lot of the podcasts I oversee, they often end up as 34 because it's like the highest they can push it with me. Like, kind of, it's like, okay, if you go past 35, that feels like a huge amount of time, doesn't it? It feels like, God, I can't commit to 36 minutes, 37 minutes. And so I think it just has to be really, 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 really good. Having said that, so with the Shamina Begum Story podcast, the episodes there were generally between 26 minutes and 34, but there was, I think the final one was over 40 minutes, but we knew it was really, 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 really worth it. And there's something also about how, you know, when you're recording a podcast, if someone psychologically thinks this is going to end up being 45 minutes long, you kind of, I think you're less punchy, aren't you? You slightly drag out the conversation. And I think there's something psychological about when you've got hosts presenting something, are you saying to them, this is how long the podcast is? It's interesting how people fill the time. So there's a discipline about, it's like, it's, you know, I said earlier about we record more than 35 minutes if the pod is 35. But if you're recording, sometimes I've been involved in podcasts where we're recording for 2 hours. And once you start recording something for 2 hours, people's speech gets really flabby. It's not just about the fact you're making loads of points, you also just kind of stretch it out. And if you're stretching it out, it's going to be duller and it's going to be less punchy. So these are all kind of considerations. It's a really good question.
But I suppose to the point about the Shamima Begum one is, that was a series, and I suppose you'd hooked everybody in.
Completely.
So actually everyone would forgive if it was slightly longer, because actually everyone wants to get to the end of that story.
Completely.
So there may be something in there
Completely,
about
but there is a trust thing, and there is an expectation, and there's a consistency thing. And actually, this applies to any medium. That, for example, and especially with the BBC, if you are saying you're doing one thing and you're creating an expectation, then if you betray the audience by providing something else, you lose that trust. And if you lose that trust, you lose that consistency of listening, and you lose subscribers. And that is kind of fundamental, I think, to be honest. And that especially applies to the BBC, because they trust you to get it right and to deliver what you said you're going to deliver. So, and there's definitely kind of, in the descriptions, if we overpromise in a description, we get feedback from the listeners, which is, you said in the title you were going to answer this question. So you said you were going to discuss this question, but you didn't really get into it. You only got into it for about 5% of the pod. Well, I've been duped there, and that's my relationship with the podcast. So if you're promising something, you've got to deliver it. Yeah.
No. Any other questions from our audience in person? No? A couple more then from our online audience. James asks, fast forward 10 years, where will podcasts sit compared with linear radio?
Well, in America, podcasts are going to overtake linear radio. So if we follow America, I mean, it's interesting because the figures obviously for linear radio, I was having this conversation with Mike over there in the corner before, obviously the audience figures for listening, for audio are far higher than for podcasting in general. So audio is, you get bigger figures in radio compared to linear radio compared to podcasting, but it's definitely is going like that, and it's going like that, and I think that we're going to be at a really interesting junction in 10 years' time. I'd say the importance of talent, the importance of formats, the importance of feeds, the importance of the first 2 minutes of your podcast. If you lose them after the first 2 minutes, you're stuffed. First 2 minutes are so utterly crucial. If I could say one thing about podcasting, it would be, if you've got a boring 2 minutes, you may as well go home. Because literally, it's such a ruthless medium. So all of those things I think are shaping the talent. I can imagine how talent are going to have far more influence in the future. I think they will have far more control. Brands are going to be really key. And I think there's a huge challenge for the BBC, huge challenge. We have obviously had a prominence in the audio market, and now this is, publishers are piling in, everyone's piling in. The Guardian are doing brilliant podcasts, Tortoise are doing brilliant podcasts. It's a really, really exciting market, and it's going to keep the BBC absolutely on its toes, which is really good.
And actually, this next question leads on quite nicely from what you were just saying. How do you create that initial hook within the first 2 minutes? Is it good sound design?
Yeah, partly. Yeah, I think it's not being too banal, not being too, just being really, you can't have any flabbiness, but you're also, I mean, there's a huge debate huge debate on how we do it, and on newscasts we try and set a certain tone and ease the listener in. So our kind of ethos is that Chris Mason, Adam Fleming, when they're chatting, you're creating instantly a vibe that it's two old mates, and they are old mates. They kind of knew each other from university. They're really close. They're really like in each other's lives, and have been in each other's lives for donkey's years. That intimacy of that relationship, that you're in this kind of friendship group. And when Laura Koosbank did it as well, the three of them got on really, really, really well, and they were able to do it. So we were really focused on creating a vibe, but the moment where it got too flabby, it was edited out. I mean, and we tried to make it as punchy as possible. And I think it's just ear-catching audio is obviously key. So it depends on the podcast, to be honest.
Another question we've had in terms of consistency of publishing, is there a frequency of posting that appears to yield the best results for an engaged audience? Daily, weekly, fortnightly, etc.?
That's an interesting question. So, it's really I think that's really, really complicated. I think that daily podcasts obviously are going to get higher numbers, which will help you in some of the marketing tools like the Apple podcast charts. So therefore, if you have a daily podcast, you're going to get the argument is you'll get noticed. You will get noticed. I think it's about a weekly podcast. It's making sure it drops the same time every single week. It's interesting with Ukrainecast because that started off 5 days a week. It then went down to 3 days a week, and we did so much comms around that decision. So we warned the audience in advance. We were really grown up about it. We said, we're going to be here the duration of this conflict. So as long as this conflict lasts, we will bring you Ukrainecast. However, we're going to go 3 days a week because actually we want to sustain the quality of the podcast, and actually we feel this is right for this particular audience. And then we went down to twice a week. And again, it was the same conversation, that trust with the relationship kind of great, because podcast listeners in general, I think they're pretty smart people. I think it's kind of like, my experience is that it's a smart medium, and because that leaning in, it's people who are genuinely quite bright and engaged.
I suppose they're taking the opportunity, they're taking the time to learn, to gain the insights on a particular issue, particularly if it's a podcast like Newscast.
Yeah.
They want to be informed.
Completely.
So there's that want to be informed.
And also, it's really hard to spin in a podcast because it's an authentic medium in a way that radio and TV sometimes might not be. It's much more intimate, and it's harder to spin. So if you're not authentic, if you're trying to be someone you're not trying to be, trying to be someone you're not, it's really tricky. Let's sniff it out.
A question again from someone who's watching online. Where do you tend to find experts for upcoming podcasts as a PR? What's the best way to get our people on your radar, or is there a way for us to see who you are looking for the BBC's range of podcasts?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I'd like to think that we're kind of really coordinated on it as the BBC. I think it just is emailing individuals I try and always get back to PRs as much as possible because I know it's kind of sometimes a thankless task, isn't it? But if you don't, like I always read them. Like every single email I've ever got from a PR, I've always read it, because you're going to hit jackpot one day, and you're going to hit, and you go and do, you Google them and you get some research and see if they're offering an expert, you check them out. So
you're the only second person we've interviewed that said that, by the way.
Oh, good. No, because like we've.
But actually, that's a great little nugget to know. You read everything.
I do read everything. Yeah. Which goes down well with my partner.
Yeah. I've actually got one more question for me, and then we'll go to the audience to see if there's any final questions. But one thing you touched on at the beginning of our conversation was, obviously for Newscast in particular, your audience is predominantly male.
Yeah.
And you talked about how it's really important, obviously, to attract more women to the podcast, more diversity to the podcast.
Yeah.
I suppose, how are you looking to do that? But how do you do that in a way that obviously still means that you are delivering content that is appealing to your existing audience and those who are used to what they're hearing and what they're getting?
I should do a caveat, which is Newscast is probably less male than other podcasts, actually, and other news podcasts in particular. So I would say that caveat. I think kind of podcasting in general, the stats I've seen is there is a male, not because of the content, but just because men tend to listen to more podcasts than women. Is the stats I've seen, and hopefully I really hope that changes. And it's a challenge for us, because obviously we have Adam and Chris, and so we had Laura Kuensberg presenting lots of episodes of Newscasts, and we're definitely looking at our Thursday TV show and working out who we can develop. And for example, with Americast, again, I hate to kind of single out people, but kind of there's some really exciting talent with Mariana Spring. Is just amazing and brilliant. So we're constantly thinking about who we're doing talent searches at the moment. What was the question?
But I suppose how you're going to grow your female audience. But I suppose, does that come to contributors as well?
I think it's about contributors. I mean, we're really good in contributors. We're definitely so the BBC has an initiative, 50-50 initiative, which has been a big success, and we hit all our kind of targets for that, which is 50-50, which is, it's really trying to make sure that there are more, particularly experts. So that's a real initiative about making sure there are female experts and particularly in areas where predominantly men have dominated it. If I can make one plea, if anyone knows some really brilliant female money-saving experts.
It's a brief for everybody.
Yeah, please email me, jonathan.aspinwall@bbc.co.uk, because we have the same conversation over and over again, and it's everyone's looking for that. That's the holy grail.
Fab.
Yeah, it's for some reason men seem to dominate that area, which is a shame.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions from the room? Oh, yeah, we've got a few actually, but if I come,
You touched on some of it earlier, but I'm wondering around timeframes, whether you ever use exclusives, whether an embargo would ever suit you. It sounds like generally it would, but just a bit more around that news cycle and when, if we really want to get on, how can we best frame it so that it's landed?
Yeah, I mean we we kind of do some exclusive. I haven't got a kind of. Have you got an example?
Well, I guess like the One Show.
Yeah.
So they say they pretty much want stuff at 6 o'clock embargo. Or 7 o'clock. And then we generally embargo stories midnight so that we can get into tomorrow's papers.
We do that. We do that. It's a similar thing to the One Show.
Are we excluding ourselves if it's been all over breakfast? And it's not the national breaking news story. Are we old news for you then?
Definitely not necessarily. And actually, again, it goes back to that evergreen thing, which is podcast episodes tend to last longer than elsewhere. I mean, I find the whole kind of, having worked at breakfast telly for years, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? All the embargoes. I mean, I kind of don't envy your job and the One Show and navigating all of that and all the kind of different and making sure that you hit the newspapers. I think we're definitely open to those conversations. So yeah, I'm sure.
I know we had a couple of other questions, but just for our live audience, because we have hit 5 o'clock, I just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone who's joined us this afternoon. If you wouldn't mind, we do have a short poll at the end for those of you joining online. If you wouldn't mind responding to that, that would be fantastic. And we'll come back to the questions in the room.
Mine was, you mentioned earlier about politicians letting their guard down.
Yeah.
But I suppose as PRs representing people,
Yes.
they're letting their guard down, and if you were to say to a journalist, you know, would you just take out that bit?
Yeah, oh, that's
usually
tricky.
It's like a no, but is
Yeah.
there any kind of leeway if, you know, conversations get too fluid? Is there leeway having that conversation?
So, that's such an interesting question. Really interesting, and it absolutely depends on the circumstances. But there is sometimes a duty of care to a contributor, which is an interesting conversation. That someone may say something which will have real world consequences. And I think that is a reasonable conversation to have from a PR perspective, that actually we feel there is a duty of care here to this particular person, and that they said something which could have quite severe consequences, or just have consequences in their life, and we're just going to level with you. And I think you'd have to be, it obviously depends on circumstances, but that's often quite a good way of phrasing it, to be honest. I have been in situations where a PR has said to me, I'm really concerned about the implications of this for this individual, for this celebrity, and actually I've listened. And obviously if there's a public service news justification, that's a really difficult conversation, and we will, you know, very much, if it's a BBC, it depends on section, but if it was something where, do you know what, it's hard to justify this on public service kind of news angle, that it's just kind of tittle tattle, and actually it could really, really cause problems, I think you'd have to be heartless not to be open to that. Yeah, I think it's how it's phrased, but duty of care is always an interesting form of words.
And I think just before we break for more wine and cake, we had one more question, I think was at the back, yeah? That's absolutely fine.
What was on, sorry I missed the start, I know you talked a little bit about the demographics in terms of male, female.
Yeah.
What are the demographics in terms of age profile?
It's younger, so it's definitely younger, yeah. So, and particularly 30-somethings. So, I mean, obviously you're talking relative in terms of kind of BBC News, it's kind of tends often to skew towards an older audience, but we are seeing 30-somethings, really healthy figures for 30-somethings, which is really exciting. Obviously, it is biased to AB, kind of, it's ABC, you know, kind of a more professional audience. Metropolitan audience probably would be the right way to say. I think the phrase is metropolitan professionals.
Yeah, very helpful. And my second question was about how much do you drill down into sort of, I guess, local examples or specific examples that maybe sit behind the news. So my reason for asking that is if you're not the main news story, how much appetite is there to be able to comment on it from a specific point of view, I suppose, or do you only look at it in terms of what's already been in?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to answer that. I mean, kind of case studies, I guess, we're really interested in. And across the BBC News, once you get one person picking up on BBC News, then everyone kind of, you've probably seen this yourself, everyone then piles in on that one particular person. So it's just case-by-case basis on that, I guess, yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Oh,
Can I have a quick one?
a very quick one.
People in studio in Manchester, or are you more open to other
I think kind of the visualization thing is the most important thing. So we do loads of our podcasts from London, and we do some from Manchester, from Salford. Visualization is the key thing. I mean, you know, I'd say invest in a bloody decent Zoom link, for God's sake. You know, like, it's so interesting kind of how many people have still got crappy Zoom cameras up noses, and kind of like, it's just like, oh my God. I mean, I have, but I'm not on air. But you know, so if you want to go on social media, it's just so interesting looking at the kind of the stats on digital social media videos. And there's something just about, if someone isn't framed properly, I swear it's fascinating how on social media that video will do less well than the one which is framed properly. Like everyone just has an aversion now to crappy looking tech. It just, it's so key. But I personally, obviously the kind of face-to-face with a host is always more intimate. The conversation flows better, but it's just about that visualization aspect, which is key.
Fab. Thank you so much to everybody. Please do stay for more. There's loads of cake and sweet treats that need eating, and drinks as well. But thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Jonathan.
Oh, thank you.